Alright, so hi everyone, my name is Crystal. For those of you who don't know me, I usually give workshops and speak at technology conferences about everything related to creative coding. Since I'm stuck at home, like many of you are as well, I thought it would be interesting for me to share some of the materials that I had created for my latest workshops here. So let's see how it goes. In this video series, I'm going to share some techniques of motion design with Vue and how you can use motion to improve your own projects. If you have any doubts or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment on this video or reach out to me through Twitter or GitHub. Everywhere on the internet, my username is always Crystal Campioni. Before we actually start talking about code, I thought it would be interesting for us to stop for a moment and think about what is an animation. So the word animation actually comes from anima, which is a word in Latin that means soul. And it's interesting because it's as if we were giving soul to some object. And if you think about it in real life, things that don't, just pop in your face because it'd be freaking scary if they did that. What happens in real life is that things actually move from one place to the other. Like this furry monster in real life, moving from one side of the screen to the other. Ideally, the same thing should also apply to our interfaces, because when we push our UI to mimic what happens in real life, it's easier for our brains to understand what's going on and understand where things live in the interface. Before we talk about JavaScript, I would like us to also go through a brief explanation of how CSS animations work, because that's going to be important for everything that we'll discuss later on. So the way that you can define an animation sequence in CSS is by using the syntax. Add keyframes, define an animation name, and then create the blocks for each step of your animation. It can either be a simple from and to, if your animation only has 2 steps, or it can have multiple steps defined by percentages. In my second example, the animation would start to play with translate y 0. By the middle of the sequence, it would go to minus 100 pixels, and by the end of it, it would finish with 100 pixels. Theoretically, you can use any CSS property in your animations, but I would recommend you sticking to transforms and opacity so that you don't run into any performance issues. After you have defined your animation keyframes, you can actually apply them to any DOM element by using the animation property in CSS. You can either use the shorthand version that you can see on the top of the screen or define each property one by one. So the animation name will point to the string that you define in your keyframes. The animation duration is how many seconds the animation should last before stopping or repeating. You can actually use this property to define how fast or slow the animation should play. Animation iteration count is how many times it should play before it stops. It can either be a number, or you can set it to infinite if you want the animation to keep looping forever. Animation direction can be set to normal, reverse, or alternate, meaning that it can play forwards, backwards, or alternate between one and the other. This can also be useful to define which frame you want the animation to use after it stops, after it finishes. For example, we can freeze some animation in the last frame if we set the animation to play forwards. And the animation timing function, which is interesting. So let's have a look at it separately. The animation timing function, by using it, we can completely alter the perception that we have about some animation without changing any of the other properties, like duration, for example. In this example, you can see that all of the boxes leave the initial position at the same time and they reach the final position at the same time. The only thing that we are changing here is the timing function. If you'd like to play with timing functions by yourself, and I highly recommend you to do so because it's easier for you to understand if you try it by yourself, you can pause the video and go to the URL that you can see on the screen. Another really important property is the transform origin. As you can see on this example, all of the boxes have the same animation applied, and the only thing that we are changing is the transform origin. You can set it to be either a keyword like bottom, right, left, or top, or you can use X and Y coordinates to define one specific point. In this example, I'm actually marking this specific point for the transform origin with the blue dot. And this can be really useful if you want to create animations with chaining objects, or for example, if you are animating a character and each one of the joints of the character would be a different transform origin. You can theoretically also use percentages, but it doesn't seem to play out so nicely with all of the browsers, so I would recommend not using that. The Chrome DevTools actually has a really nice built-in tools that you can use to test out the different timing functions of your CSS just by clicking on the little icon after you apply some animation to it. And you can also play around with the different properties of your animation. It's time for our first exercise. So the goal here is to improve the bounce animation, implement the shadow animation, and synchronize both of them. It's important to pay attention of how the ball is going to deform when it hits the ground and go back to its original shape when it's farther away from the ground. Um, and also make sure that both the shadow animation and the ball animation are synced, and that the shadow should change in size depending on how far or close the ball is from the ground. You can see the starting code and work on by yourself in the URL that you can see on the video, and I'll go through my solution in the next one.